wedding night was a cold dew, until the Duke discovered the marks she hid under silk and lace. From the highest tower, Lady Alara stared down at the frozen gardens below, her gloved hands trembling slightly, though not from the cold. Today, she was to be married. The Duke of Ravenhurst, Thorian, a man whispered about in hushed tones across kingdoms, awaited her at the altar. Yet for her, this union was no dream of love. It was a duty, icy and unyielding. Alara's heart thumped, a wild drum against the cage of her ribs. She had spent nights imagining this day, yet never like this. Her life had been shaped by expectation and shadow, a legacy of her family's name tangled with whispers of curses and lost fortunes. No one had asked her if she wanted this marriage. It had been decided before she could even understand the weight of her own name. And yet, she was here, standing on the threshold of a destiny she neither desired nor understood. The castle halls were vast and dim, the ceilings carved with ancient patterns of beasts and kings long gone. Servants bustled quietly, carrying silver candelabras and trailing velvet carpets through the corridors. Every step Alara took echoed like a drumbeat of fate. Her gown was a river of pale silk, embroidered with threads that caught the candlelight like frozen tears. Beneath the delicate fabric, she hid the marks that had defined her life, lines and symbols etched across her arms and shoulders, a curse that had haunted her family for generations. No one had seen them, and she intended to keep it that way. At the top of the grand staircase, she paused. The hall beyond was filled with nobility from rival houses, their faces polite but their eyes sharp. Whispers rose like the soft hiss of winter wind. "The Duke has chosen well, or perhaps poorly," one woman murmured to another. Alara could hear them but did not respond. She had learned early that attention was both a shield and a weapon. Duke Thorian waited at the far end of the hall, a figure carved from ice and steel. His cloak was black as a raven's wing, the lining of crimson that hinted at fire beneath the frost. His posture was rigid, and his face was unreadable. Eyes dark and calculating studied her as she descended the staircase. Every noble in the hall held their breath, sensing the power in the room, and yet none dared to meet Thorian's gaze. Alara's steps were careful, measured, as if each movement might shatter the fragile tension that hung over the room. She felt his eyes on her, sharp and penetrating, though he said nothing. The Duke's silence was as heavy as stone, as commanding as a sword held at the throat. For a moment the whispers of the crowd seemed to vanish, leaving only the sound of their breathing, the distant wind, and the quiet thump of her own heart. When she reached the altar, Thorian finally spoke, his voice smooth and steady, though carrying the weight of authority. "Lady Alara," he said, "you stand here as the Duchess of Ravenhurst. Do you accept this union?" Her lips moved, and she spoke words that felt strange and foreign on her tongue. "I do." The ceremony continued, a blur of vows, gilded rings, and solemn declarations. The priest's voice echoed through the great hall, yet Alara barely heard it. Her thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the fear of what was to come. The Duke's eyes never left her. Each glance seemed to weigh her, measure her, as if he could see through the silk and lace, straight to the truth she had hidden for so long. As the final words of the ceremony fell into silence, the hall erupted into polite applause. Alara felt the pressure of 1,000 eyes upon her, and yet her own gaze remained fixed on Thorian. There was a subtle shift in his expression, something that made her pulse quicken. For a fleeting moment, the cold, unyielding mask slipped, revealing a spark of interest, perhaps even curiosity. The newlyweds retired to the private chambers, a suite carved high into the castle tower, its windows framing the storm-tossed sea below. Snowflakes clung to the panes like fragile crystals, and the fire in the hearth danced with shadows that flickered across the stone walls. Thorian closed the door behind them and turned to face her, the room suddenly smaller and heavier with unspoken words. Alara's hands trembled as she adjusted the sleeve of her gown, careful to keep the marks hidden. She could feel his gaze, sharp as a blade, on her arm, and a shiver ran down her spine. "Your marks," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper though it carried the weight of command. "I saw them briefly as you descended." Her breath caught. You saw nothing," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. She had practiced this lie countless times, yet something in his tone made her hesitate. It was not anger. It was not judgment. It was interest, deep and deliberate, like he was piecing together a puzzle centuries in the making. Thorian stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in the small room. "They are more than just scars, Lady Alara," he said. "They speak of power and pain. I am curious which they hold more of in you." Alara's heart hammered. No one had ever spoken to her this way. In court she was always measured, careful, invisible. Yet here, in the intimacy of the room, this man, this duke, feared across kingdoms, saw her in a way that frightened and fascinated her. "I am, as I always have been," she whispered, though the words felt inadequate. How could she explain the centuries of fear and solitude, the silent nights spent hiding her body beneath silk, the constant vigilance required to keep her secret safe? Thorian regarded her silently, a slow, deliberate motion that made her pulse rise. Then, without another word, he turned toward the hearth, letting the firelight bathe him in gold and shadow. The air between them was thick with tension, fragile as glass. Neither moved, neither spoke, yet both were aware of a shift. Something had begun that could not be undone. The night stretched on, the storm outside battering the castle walls. Alara tried to keep her thoughts in check, but they raced ahead, imagining the challenges to come. The Duke was not a man to be underestimated. She had heard the tales of his ruthlessness, his control over armies and politics, his ability to bend men to his will. And yet, in the quiet of the chamber, she sensed a different kind of power, one that came from restraint, observation, and patience. She wondered what he saw in her. The marks, certainly, but more than that, something hidden in her gaze, a spark of defiance, a strength she had cultivated in solitude. She had survived countless trials, hidden her pain from the world, and now stood before a man who could see through it all. Could she trust him? Could she allow herself to? The hours passed like shadows, and the storm outside began to wane, leaving a brittle silence in its wake. Alara stood near the window, gazing at the jagged cliffs below, and felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. This marriage, though forced, had begun to take shape into something unrecognizable. It was no longer just a cold duty. There was tension, curiosity, and the faintest whisper of connection. Thorian approached her once more, his dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. "You fear me," he said softly, yet there was no accusation in his tone, only observation. "Yes," she admitted, her voice trembling. "And I do not know why I do." He studied her, and for the first time the chill in his expression softened. "Fear is often the first step toward understanding," he murmured. "Do not mistake caution for weakness, Lady Alara. You are stronger than most realize." The words lingered between them, fragile yet potent, like embers in the hearth. Alara felt a flutter of hope she had not expected, even as uncertainty remained. In this castle of stone and shadow, in a union born of duty, something was beginning to take root, something neither could yet name. As she prepared to retire for the night, adjusting the layers of silk and lace over her arms, she felt his gaze on her once more. There was no judgment, only a question, a silent challenge, an invitation to reveal herself, to let the past and the curse and the hidden power emerge. And as the door closed behind the Duke, leaving her alone in the flickering candlelight, Alara allowed herself a single, quiet thought. Perhaps this marriage was no longer only about duty. Perhaps it could become something else, something dangerous, something real. Yet beneath the firelight, beneath the quiet tension, her hidden marks throbbed faintly, as if aware that their secret had been discovered, even in part. The weight of their power pressed against her skin, a reminder that nothing in this world, or in the Duke's castle, was ever truly safe. The first night of the marriage ended with a storm outside, a storm within her heart, and a single, undeniable truth. The Duke had seen her secret, and in doing so, everything had changed. The morning light spilled cold and pale through the high windows of Castle Ravenhurst. Lady Alara stood by the window in the private chambers, her fingers tracing the delicate embroidery on her gown, yet her mind was far from the golden threads. The night had been restless. Thorian's gaze had lingered on her in ways that made her heart race and her thoughts whirl. She could not forget the moment he had seen her marks. Even though he had said nothing, the knowledge had shifted something between them, a quiet tension that both terrified and intrigued her. Thorian, on the other hand, moved silently through the chambers, his boots muffled by the thick carpet. He had spent the night thinking not of her beauty, though she was striking, but of the power she carried, hidden beneath the silk and lace. It was rare to find someone whose strength and curse intertwined so closely, someone who carried both fragility and danger in equal measure. He approached her slowly, as if testing whether she would flee or stand firm. "Alara," he said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made her turn. "We need to speak." She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "About the marks?" she asked quietly. He nodded once, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. "I know about them. I know what they mean." Her heart lurched. No one had ever spoken of them with such certainty. Even the wisest scholars had only whispered rumors, fearing the power the marks carried. Yet here was the Duke, the feared ruler of Ravenhurst, speaking as though he understood everything, yet without judgment. Alara's hands twisted nervously in front of her. "Then, you know of my family's curse," she whispered. "You know the danger it brings." Thorian's gaze softened just slightly, and he gestured for her to sit. She did, though her body remained tense, ready to flee at the slightest sign of threat. "I do," he said. "And yet I see not just danger in it. I see strength. You have survived something that would have broken most. That is why I do not fear you, not completely." Alara's lips parted in surprise. Fear had been her companion for so long, but trust had never found a place in her life. And yet the way he spoke, careful, measured, not condescending, made her feel as if she might survive being seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. For several moments they sat in silence. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, carrying the first snow of winter in soft white flakes. Inside, the castle seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that something profound was unfolding in that chamber. Finally, Thorian spoke again, softer this time, almost a whisper. "Tell me what the marks have cost you, Alara. Not the world, not the nobility, but you. What have you sacrificed to survive?" Alara hesitated. The question pierced deeper than she expected. She had learned to hide, to bow, to blend into shadows so that no one could see her weakness or her power. And yet, here was a man, a duke, asking for truth without demanding it. "They remind me of everything I've endured," she said slowly. "Of the curse on my family. Of the people who feared me, who tried to control me. I've had to hide who I am, even from myself at times." Her voice trembled slightly, but she did not look away. I thought no one could understand." Thorian leaned closer, his dark cloak brushing the floor like a shadow of intent. "I may understand more than you realize," he said, "but understanding does not mean mercy. You will need to trust me to survive what is coming." Alara's pulse quickened. Trust was a dangerous word. It was fragile, fleeting, and could be broken in a heartbeat. And yet, something in his tone, something in his eyes made her feel as if trust might be possible. Before she could answer, a sharp knock came at the door. A young servant entered, bowing quickly. "Your Grace, the council requests your presence. There is news from the northern borders. They speak of shadows moving among the villages." Thorian's expression darkened. He nodded at the servant. "Thank you. Inform them I will join them shortly." When the servant left, his gaze returned to Alara. "It seems danger is already stirring," he said, and it will not wait for polite ceremonies or hidden secrets. Alara swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. The curse she carried was more than a family burden. It was a force that drew attention, even danger, to those she loved. She realized with a start that she was no longer alone. Thorian would face it with her, or at least he would attempt to. The next days passed in a strange rhythm. Court sessions, meetings with nobles, and Thorian's subtle, careful observations of her every movement filled her hours. Yet beneath the surface of formal duties, a different game was unfolding. They spoke less of politics and more of understanding. Thorian asked questions, precise and probing, testing her knowledge of her own power, her past, and her fears. Alara found herself revealing more than she intended. She spoke of nights when the wind howled and shadows whispered, of dreams that seemed too real to dismiss, and of the burden of knowing that her body carried a secret no one could see but could destroy everything if it fell into the wrong hands. Thorian listened, never interrupting, his expression unreadable. Yet the slight narrowing of his eyes, the small tilt of his head betrayed his focus. He was calculating, measuring, and yet there was something else, an admiration buried beneath layers of caution. Then one evening, as snow fell silently against the windows, a sudden tremor shook the castle. Candles flickered, and a cold draft rushed through the halls. Alara froze, sensing it before she saw it, shadows moving at the edge of her vision, shapes that were darker than night itself. Thorian was immediately at her side, hand on the hilt of his sword. "Stay close," he ordered. "Do not move." The shadows seemed to test the walls, creeping silently, almost sentient in their motion. Alara's breath caught. She had never sensed her curse so directly, so near. It was as if the very air around her knew her secret, and it stirred in response. "Do you control this?" she whispered, though she knew the answer. Her curse was her own, yet it often attracted forces beyond her will. Thorian's eyes were dark and alert. "No," he said, "but I intend to protect you while we learn what it wants." The shadow passed, leaving a chill behind, a reminder that the world beyond the castle was more dangerous than she had imagined. And yet, for the first time, she did not feel entirely alone. The Duke had chosen to stand by her, not merely as a husband or ruler, but as a partner in the face of something that could destroy them both. In the days that followed, Thorian and Alara trained together, not with swords or shields, but with knowledge. He taught her how to anticipate movements, how to guard herself, and how to harness her awareness without succumbing to fear. She taught him of the history of her family, of the curse, and of the marks that spoke of pain and power alike. Their connection deepened, a fragile thread weaving between caution, curiosity, and the first sparks of trust. Yet the court remained a place of tension. Nobles whispered, some in fear, some in envy. Every glance, every gesture was scrutinized. They could not afford weakness. One evening, Thorian led her to the castle balcony, overlooking the dark cliffs and the restless sea below. The wind was biting, yet it carried a strange clarity. "Alara," he said, voice low, "you have hidden this curse for so long, yet now it will be our challenge together. I cannot promise ease or comfort, but I can promise this: I will not turn away." Alara shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of his words. I am not sure I am ready," she admitted, her voice trembling. "The curse, it is older and stronger than I am sometimes." Thorian's gaze softened. "Perhaps, but you are not alone, and together we may discover strength in ways neither of us expected." A quiet understanding passed between them, more profound than any words could convey. The marks she had feared would define her life were no longer a secret she bore alone. The Duke, distant and commanding though he was, had seen them and chosen to remain. As the night deepened, the castle seemed to grow quieter, yet the air held a tension neither could ignore. The shadows outside the walls were still moving, subtle yet deliberate, a warning that the world was far from safe. And as Alara returned to her chambers, she realized that nothing in her life would ever be the same. Thorian stood at the doorway, a silent sentinel in the dim candlelight. For a moment their eyes met, and Alara saw not just authority or power, but understanding and a promise of protection. It was fragile, untested, but it was real. And then, as she prepared for the night, adjusting the silk over her arms to conceal the marks that still throbbed faintly, she felt a presence at the edge of her awareness, another shadow unseen, but somehow connected to the curse she carried. She froze, heart racing. Thorian stepped beside her, eyes dark and alert. "We are not safe yet," he said quietly, "but together we will face it." Alara nodded, a mixture of fear and determination in her chest. The Duke had discovered her marks, and with that discovery their lives had changed forever. They were bound now, not only by duty, but by the shared burden of power, fear, and the first stirrings of trust. And as the night deepened, the castle seemed to hold its breath once more, waiting for the next shadow to arrive. Winter had deepened over Castle Ravenhurst. The walls, once silent and forbidding, now carried whispers of anticipation and tension. Lady Alara moved through the halls with measured steps, her gown brushing the cold stone floors. The Duke had become both a protector and a presence she could not ignore, and their private conversations had grown more frequent, more intimate, though always careful. The shadows outside the castle had not disappeared. Rumors reached the court of strange figures glimpsed along the cliffs, their forms twisting in ways that defied human sight. Alara sensed them as more than mere gossip. Her curse had never been just a family burden. It was a beacon, drawing forces that sought its power. And though she had thought the Duke might falter, he had not. He stood close to her, ever vigilant, always ready. Thorian watched her from the balcony, the night sky stretching behind him like a black canvas dotted with stars. The wind carried the scent of snow and sea, and his cloak snapped lightly against the stone. "You have grown stronger in these days, Alara," he said quietly, his voice blending with the whisper of the wind. She turned to him, her breath visible in the cold night air. I have tried. I must be ready for what is coming. The shadows, the curse, they do not wait." He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking in a way that made her pulse quicken. "Nor should you face it alone," he said. There was no command in his tone now, only a firm statement, a promise. "You must trust that I will stand with you as long as you allow it." Alara looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the pale starlight. There was so much she did not know about him, the depth of his past, the secrets that had forged him into the Duke of Ravenhurst, but she felt an undeniable pull. A part of her wanted to lean into his presence, to find solace in the fact that he did not fear her, her power, or the curse that clung to her skin. "Thorian," she whispered, "what if I am not strong enough?" His gaze softened, though the fire of resolve remained. "Then I will help you become strong," he replied. "But do not underestimate yourself. You have endured more than anyone here could imagine. That endurance is strength in its own right." A silence followed, the kind that carries understanding rather than awkwardness. The Duke and Duchess stood together, shoulder to shoulder, watching the black cliffs and the restless sea. For the first time, Alara felt that the marriage, which had begun as cold duty, might grow into something far more complex. Something that could survive even the dangers that approached. The next day, as the sun struggled to shine through heavy clouds, an unexpected visitor arrived at the castle gates. A messenger, cloaked in dark green, bearing a sealed letter with the mark of an ancient order. Thorian's brow furrowed as he broke the seal and read the contents. "The northern villages," he muttered. "The shadows are more organized than I feared. Someone or something is seeking you, Alara." Her stomach tightened. She had feared that her curse might draw attention, but she had not imagined it would move so quickly, so deliberately. "What do they want?" she asked. Thorian's jaw tightened. "Power, knowledge, perhaps revenge. The curse in your bloodline is not merely a mark, it is a key. And there are those who will do anything to possess it." Alara felt a chill that was not from the winter air. She had trained herself to hide her fear, to maintain composure even when danger loomed, but the thought of someone targeting her for her very existence was frightening. And yet she was not afraid of facing it alone. Thorian would stand with her, even if the world sought to tear them apart. That evening, Thorian led her to the castle's training hall. Though she had never held a sword in earnest, he insisted she learn to defend herself. "The shadows may not strike in ways we expect," he said. "You must be ready for anything." Alara lifted the wooden practice sword, feeling the weight of it in her hands. She had expected this to be a simple exercise, but Thorian's training was precise, almost poetic in its rhythm. He moved with her, guiding her posture, showing her how to anticipate, how to strike and retreat with controlled grace. Hours passed, the chill of the hall forgotten in their focus. There was a strange intimacy in these moments, a closeness forged not by words but by shared effort. Every touch of his hand correcting her stance, every glance that lingered longer than necessary, carried tension she could not deny. At one point, their hands brushed, and Alara felt a spark, a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. Thorian's eyes met hers, dark and unreadable, yet something flickered beneath the surface. Something that hinted at desire tempered by caution, curiosity tempered by restraint. "Do you understand what this is, Lady Alara?" he asked, his voice low, almost teasing, though there was an edge of seriousness. "The dance of power, of trust, of knowing one's limits," she nodded, though her heart raced. "Yes and no. I am learning, but it feels dangerous." "And exciting." Thorian's lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile. "Good. Then you are beginning to understand. Danger and excitement often walk together, especially in our world." Their lesson ended with the sun setting in a blaze of red and gold, casting long shadows across the hall. Alara felt a mixture of pride and exhaustion. She had never imagined herself capable of this, of standing against an opponent, of holding her own against the Duke of Ravenhurst. Yet something deep inside her stirred, a confidence she had never allowed herself before. That night, as the castle settled into quiet, the shadows outside returned. Alara was in her chambers, her hands folded over her chest as she listened to the faint creaks of the castle. Thorian entered, as always, silently, but this time with a look of urgency. "They are coming," he said, his voice taut with tension. "The ones tied to your bloodline, the curse, they are testing us, probing for weakness." Alara's heart thudded. "Then we must be ready," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her fear. Thorian stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. It was not the hand of a commander, but of someone offering strength. "And we will be," he said, "together." The air in the chamber seemed to shift, charged with anticipation. Alara felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. This was no longer merely a marriage of convenience. It was a partnership, forged in the fires of shared danger. Over the next several days, they trained, studied, and planned. Every moment together deepened their bond. Thorian began to see not just the marks and the curse, but the woman who carried them, the courage, the cleverness, and the quiet defiance that had allowed her to survive thus far. Alara, in turn, saw in Thorian more than the cold, commanding Duke. She glimpsed the man beneath the armor of authority, thoughtful, patient, and willing to meet her in the space where power and vulnerability intersected. She found herself leaning on him in ways she had never allowed anyone, not even family, to see. But the shadows were patient, and the danger they carried grew bolder. One night, as Alara walked through the gardens wrapped in a thick cloak, she felt a sudden chill, unnatural even for winter. Shapes moved along the edges of the hedges, silent and deliberate. She froze, heart racing, instinct telling her to flee. Before she could move, a hand grasped her arm firmly but not roughly. Thorian appeared beside her, eyes scanning the darkness. "They are close," he said. "Do not run, stand with me." Alara nodded, gripping her cloak tightly. The shadows stepped closer, twisting shapes that seemed almost alive. She could feel the pull of her curse, the connection between herself and the darkness that sought her. And yet, she did not feel alone. Thorian's presence steadied her. His hand remained lightly on her arm, a tether to courage and reason. "Focus," he whispered. "You are stronger than you know." Together, they faced the approaching figures. Though the shadows moved unnaturally, they hesitated at the strength radiating from Alara and the calm authority of Thorian. The first night of confrontation ended without violence, yet the warning was clear. The curse, the power, and the danger were all moving toward them, inexorably. Alara looked at Thorian, his dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. I trust you," she said softly, though the words felt like a revelation even to herself. Thorian's gaze softened, and for a moment the mask of the Duke fell away, revealing the man beneath. "And I trust you," he replied. "We will face this together no matter what comes." As they returned to the castle, the wind carried a promise of more danger, but also of the bond that had begun to grow between them. A connection forged in shadows and steel, in trust and fear, in the first stirrings of something neither had expected. And somewhere in the night, beyond the walls of Ravenhurst, the figures waiting in shadow whispered to one another, plotting their next move, unaware that the Duke and Duchess were already preparing for the battle to come. The storm came without warning. Thunder rolled across the cliffs like the roar of an ancient beast, and snow swirled against the castle walls, thick and blinding. Inside Castle Ravenhurst, Lady Alara stood at the top of the highest tower, her dark hair tangled by the wind, her gown whipping around her legs. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold but from anticipation. Thorian appeared beside her, his cloak flaring with the wind, his eyes dark and unreadable. "It has begun," he said simply. "The curse is stirring more than ever, and it will not wait for us to be ready." Alara's heart raced. She had feared this moment for years, yet now that it had come, she found a strange resolve settling within her. The shadows that had haunted her life, that had followed her family for generations, were moving with purpose. They sought her, tested her, threatened everything she had learned to care about. And yet she was not alone. "Then we face it together," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "No matter what comes." Thorian's gaze softened just slightly, but the fire of determination remained. "Together," he agreed. They descended to the castle's great hall, where the storm's energy seemed to seep into the very stone. Shadows twisted along the edges of the room, flickering and alive, drawn by the curse that marked Alara's skin. Some took human shapes, others monstrous forms, but all radiated a dark hunger. Alara stepped forward, focusing on the pulse of the power that ran through her veins. The marks on her arms glowed faintly under the layers of silk, responding to her intent. The energy was raw, wild, and dangerous, yet it answered her call. Thorian moved beside her, his sword drawn, his presence steadying her as he had done countless times in the past days. The first wave of shadows lunged. Alara felt her pulse quicken and instinctively raised her hands. A force, subtle but undeniable, radiated from her, pushing the shadows back. They hissed, recoiling from the strange power they could not touch. Thorian met them with precision and strength, his blade cutting through the dark forms with calculated grace. Together, they moved like two halves of a single force, her energy shaping the battlefield, his strength enforcing it. But the shadows did not relent. They shifted, combined, and formed a towering figure, a dark specter with eyes like molten silver, a presence that radiated centuries of rage and power. Alara's breath caught. This was the source of the curse, the force that had followed her family for generations. Thorian's hand found hers, and in that touch she felt steadiness, courage, and something deeper, trust. "We can face it," he said quietly. "Do not falter now." Alara nodded. She focused, feeling the marks on her arms pulse in response to her will. Memories of her ancestors, their endurance, their wisdom, their sacrifices flowed through her. The specter hissed and struck, but Alara raised her hands, and a shield of energy, woven from the bloodline's power, absorbed the blow. Thorian moved beside her, striking with swift precision at the creature, his blade catching glimpses of lightning that seemed to answer the storm outside. The battle raged, the great hall alive with energy, shadow, and power. Alara and Thorian moved as one, anticipating each other's movements without a word. Every strike, every push, every surge of energy brought them closer, not just as allies but as partners in every sense. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm within the hall, wind and snow battering the castle, yet they stood firm. Exhaustion pressed upon them, yet they did not waver. Alara drew deeper from the power within her, feeling it flow through the marks like fire and ice intertwined. Thorian's voice broke through the chaos. "Trust yourself. Trust me." She took a deep breath, letting the fear fall away. She could feel the curse responding to her, the darkness retreating at the strength of her will. With a sudden surge, she unleashed a pulse of energy that struck the specter directly. It shrieked, twisting and writhing, its form breaking apart like shadows in the sunlight. Thorian pressed forward, his blade finding the heart of the creature, dispersing its remnants. When the echoes faded, silence fell over the hall. Snow drifted in through cracks in the windows, and the firelight danced across the shattered shadows. Alara sank to her knees, trembling, her body buzzing with the intensity of what had just happened. Thorian knelt beside her, his hand brushing her hair back from her face. "You did it," he said softly. "You faced it, and you were stronger than even I imagined." She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide with exhaustion and something else, relief, gratitude, and a budding sense of belonging. "We did it," she whispered. "Together." For the first time in her life, she felt that her curse, her power, and even her scars were not just a burden. They were a part of her strength, a legacy that could protect rather than destroy. And she had someone beside her who did not fear it, who did not fear her. Thorian helped her to her feet. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice low but steady. "The world outside is still dangerous, and there are others who would seek the power you carry. But tonight, we have shown that together, we are unstoppable." Alara allowed herself a small smile, feeling the tension of months melt into a fragile peace. She had feared duty, feared the Duke, feared her own power. And yet now, in the aftermath of the battle, she felt something new: trust, respect, and the quiet stirrings of love that did not need to be rushed or forced. As the night passed, the storm outside softened, leaving a brittle calm. The castle bore the marks of the confrontation. The shadows lingered faintly in the corners, dissipating slowly, as if testing whether they would return. Alara and Thorian stood together by the balcony, gazing at the cliffs and the restless sea below. "You have changed everything, Alara," Thorian said quietly. "Not just the curse, not just the danger, but even me. I am no longer just a duke bound by duty. I am someone who can care, who can trust, who can," he paused, searching for the right word, "who can be more than I thought possible." Alara's heart fluttered. "And I have learned that I am not as alone as I believed, that the power I feared can be shared, not just hidden. That I am capable." They stood in silence, the weight of the night settling over them, and yet the air was lighter than it had been for centuries. The marks on Alara's arms glowed faintly, no longer a threat, but a testament to what had been faced and survived. As dawn broke, the first light catching the frost on the cliffs, a strange glow shimmered on the edges of one of her marks. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it pulsed with life. Alara noticed it, and Thorian saw her glance. "It seems not all is finished," he said softly. "The curse may be broken, but the power within you is far from dormant." Alara nodded, a mixture of determination and awe in her chest. "Then we will face it, as we did tonight, together." Thorian's hand found hers, and in that simple gesture, 1,000 unspoken promises passed between them. They had faced shadows, curses, and the darkness of the unknown, and survived. Their connection was forged in fire and ice, in trust and courage, in the acknowledgement of strength and vulnerability alike. And as they stood together, watching the dawn over the cliffs, the world beyond the castle remained vast and uncertain. Yet for the first time, they did not fear it, not completely. For in each other they had found a partner, a protector, and something more. A bond that could endure any shadow, any storm, any challenge that fate or magic might bring. The marks on Alara's arms glowed faintly, a reminder of her legacy and her power, and a hint that their story was far from over. But for now the storm had passed, the shadows had receded, and the Duke and Duchess of Ravenhurst had discovered that together they could face anything. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the castle, where shadows lingered like whispers of old secrets, a faint voice seemed to murmur, not with menace, but with the promise of future tests. The world was waiting, but so were they.